Thank you for watching this webinar on strategies for a successful IEP meeting. My name is Stephanie Klitsch, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Education Law Program at Council for Children's Rights. Just to note that the information I am providing today is for educational purposes and is not legal advice. Before I jump into the content for this webinar, I wanted to share a little information about the Education Law Program. The Education Law Program has four main focuses. First, through our education advocacy for individual family service, we provide individual representation for students and their legal guardians in need of legal assistance regarding special education, Section 504 plans, and school discipline. Second, through our education navigation service, we work with students involved in the juvenile court system in Mecklenburg County. The service addresses issues related to students' education rights by identifying current education issues and providing detailed recommendations for how to resolve those concerns. Third, we focus on systemic education issues. We cannot individually serve all students in our community who may need our services. Instead, we strategically elevate issues that can have a broader impact on students in the community. Lastly, we provide free community trainings on topics related to education advocacy. In addition to our First Wednesday series, we provide training to parent groups and community groups by request. Here's a look at today's agenda. I will begin, as I always do, with some preliminary terms and information. Then I will discuss requesting an IEP meeting, preparing for an IEP meeting, meeting strategies, and post-meeting best practices. Before I get started, I want to go over a few terms that I will use throughout the presentation. There are many acronyms when we discuss special education and some different terms that mean the same thing. I want you to understand that students who receive special education have an Individualized Education Program, an IEP. They're also called exceptional children, EC. EC is a North Carolina specific term. Ultimately, when we are talking about EC services, IEP services, or special education, we are talking about the same services and can use those terms interchangeably. The Special Education Decision Maker, or SEDM, is a term you will hear me use throughout this presentation. I'm going to use it instead of using the term parent when discussing special education services, and let me explain why. SEDM is an umbrella term that incorporates all of the different individuals that might be making the special education decisions for a student. For the majority of students, it is their biological or adoptive parents. For others, though, it is more complicated. For students that live with non-parent legal guardians or are in the foster care system, the SEDM might not be their parent. Other options include non-therapeutic foster parents, former guardians, kinship placements, local educational agency assigned surrogate parents, or court-appointed special education decision makers. SEDM is the person legally acting as the student's parent for purposes of special education decisions. This is the individual who requests an EC evaluation, consents to EC services, and has the right to pursue dispute resolution strategies. So while for most students their SEDM will be their parent, I'm going to use the term SEDM to be inclusive of all possible individuals who might be making special education decisions on behalf of students. This term does not apply when I'm discussing Section 504 plans. When referring to Section 504, I will use the term parent/legal guardian. Some families choose to send their student to charter schools instead of a typical public school district. Charter schools are public schools authorized by the State Board of Education and operated by independent nonprofit boards of directors. Everything that I will discuss in this training applies to charter schools as well as traditional public school districts. Charter schools must follow special education law, Section 504 law, and North Carolina law on school discipline. Too often, we learn of situations where charter schools are telling families that they do not need to comply with these laws. So we want to make it clear that students have the same rights in charter schools as they do in traditional public school districts. Next, I'm going to do a brief overview of the different types of education interventions. We like to begin trainings with these slides so that everyone is aware of what we mean when we talk about terms like IEP and Section 504 plan. This graphic helps us take a step back and understand what types of services are available to different groups of students. The largest circle incorporates all students, whether or not they have a disability. Any student who is struggling academically or behaviorally in school can receive extra assistance. In North Carolina, this is through something called Multi-Tiered System of Support, MTSS. You do not need a disability in order to receive support through MTSS. In order to fall into either of the two smaller circles, a student must have a qualifying disability. The bigger of the two circles is Section 504. As we will learn, more students with disabilities fall under Section 504 than under special education. Special education is the smallest circle because it has the most stringent eligibility requirements. As I mentioned, MTSS is available to any student whether or not they have a disability. It's intended to provide extra support and interventions to students with additional needs. MTSS involves different tiers of support. All students are considered on Tier 1 and have access to high-quality instruction. At Tier 2, students with identified academic or behavioral needs receive some small group intervention. At Tier 3, that's the highest tier of MTSS. With this tier, students receive more intensive, individualized supports. A key component of MTSS is universal screening. This is intended to identify students who need supplemental support. By the time students get to Tier 3, they should be receiving evidence-based interventions to respond to their specific needs. Progress monitoring is a part of MTSS as well. This means that there are specific goals that the interventions are intended to address, and data is regularly collected to determine whether students are making progress toward those goals. Families need to be aware when their student is on a Tier 2 or Tier 3 plan and actively participate in the process. There are generally meetings to review the student's progress, and the family should attend and ask to get regular updates based on the progress monitoring. The MTSS team can make a referral to special education if they believe that the student may qualify for an IEP. This referral can happen concurrent with MTSS interventions and need not wait until those interventions have been exhausted. Let's talk briefly now about who qualifies for special education services, which was the smallest circle in that first graphic. For a student to receive special education services, the student must meet all of the following criteria: be between the ages of 3 and 21, meet the criteria for at least one of 14 disability eligibility categories. In North Carolina, each eligibility category has specific requirements that must be shown for the student to fall under that category. For instance, a diagnosis of autism by itself does not necessarily mean that a student will automatically be eligible under the autism eligibility category. And lastly, they must have a disability that adversely affects their educational performance and requires specially designed instruction. I want to point out that educational performance is broader than academic performance. A student can be advancing from grade to grade and have passing scores in their classes and still be eligible. Educational performance also includes things like their social interactions and behavioral needs. Here is a list of all 14 eligibility categories in North Carolina. IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. The P in IEP stands for program and not plan. And that is because an IEP incorporates all of the special education services that a student receives. The IEP document itself is long, generally at least 15 pages, and it's very detailed. Included in the IEP document are the student's strengths, weaknesses, and needs, measurable goals for the student to achieve in the course of the year, the accommodations and modifications, related services, and specially designed instruction necessary to help the student reach their IEP goals. It also includes where the services will be provided. And this doesn't mean the actual location, such as Myers Park High School versus West Charlotte High School. Instead, this refers to whether the student will receive the services with their non-disabled peers or instead in a setting with only other students with disabilities. For many students, it ends up being a combination of those options. The IEP document is developed by an IEP team, which must include the special education decision maker. All special education students are entitled to something called a free appropriate public education, or a FAPE. FAPE is a legal standard that requires all students' IEPs to be sufficient for the student to achieve reasonable educational progress. We often receive questions about the difference between IEPs and Section 504 plans. As I've said, all students who receive special education services have an IEP. Students with IEPs receive at least some amount of specially designed instruction with a special education teacher. So specially designed instruction is adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to meet the unique needs of a student that results from the student's disability. Section 504 accommodation plans, however, are for students with disabilities whose needs do not rise to the level of requiring specially designed instruction from a special education teacher. These students receive all of their instruction in a general education environment. They receive accommodations and modifications that their general education teacher can implement to allow the student to have access to their education. Also, Section 504 has a broader definition of disability. So more students qualify under Section 504 than qualify for special education. This is why the Section 504 circle in the first graphic was bigger than the special education circle. If a student has an IEP, they do not require a Section 504 plan because everything that would be on the Section 504 plan would be incorporated into the IEP. Hopefully, an example will help illustrate the difference between an IEP and a Section 504 plan. Sam meets eligibility criteria as a student with a specific learning disability. His IEP provides services with a special education teacher several times a week to address his individual goals in reading, writing, math, and organization. He also receives modified assignments, extended time on tests, and takes tests in a room with fewer students. On the other hand, Erin has severe myopia, which is nearsightedness. Her Section 504 plan requires seating near the teacher and board, and all printed materials be presented in a larger font. As you can see, Erin does not have any special education services or any individual goals like Sam has. Also, Sam receives accommodations and modifications that, if those were all he needed, could be on a Section 504 plan. Those accommodations and modifications are modified assignments, extended time on tests, and taking tests in a separate setting. Here are some important similarities between IEPs and Section 504 plans. They both generally have review meetings every year. IEPs are required to be reviewed annually, and while that requirement is not in the law for Section 504 plans, it is common practice for them to be reviewed annually as well. These are very important meetings for families to attend. While there is only one meeting required each year, families can request an IEP or Section 504 meeting at any time during the school year. Lastly, IEP teams and Section 504 teams can spend hours and hours drafting a beautiful document. But if it's not actually implemented, then it's functionally worthless. It's critical for families to follow up with the teachers to make sure that the services, accommodations, and modifications are actually being provided as written. Let's transition to our topic for today, strategies for a successful IEP meeting. My intention is to provide you with information that will be useful in preparing for any type of IEP meeting, such as the annual review meeting or a meeting that you request to address a concern. I'm going to begin by briefly reviewing when IEP meetings occur and how to request one. I cover in detail the special education eligibility process in a different training, but I wanted to share a bit about the process of requesting an IEP for students that don't have a current IEP. When a family believes that a student may need special education services, the SEDM must request a special education evaluation in writing. This can be submitted in the SEDM's native language. While all important communication to the school should be in writing, it's especially critical here that this request is put in writing. In writing can be a handwritten letter or an email. As I'll discuss on the next slide, once that written communication is received, a timeline begins, which dictates how quickly the student must be evaluated. We often hear from families that say that they've asked for an IEP for their student and nothing ever happened. Our first question always is whether the request was made in writing. Often we find that that never happened. There is no magic language that needs to be included in the request. However, it is helpful when it indicates why the SEDM believes that special education may be needed. The written request for an evaluation should be sent to the student's principal, teacher, and/or other school professional. We suggest sending it to more than one person to be sure that it is received. This is easy to do with email when you can send it to multiple people at once. Larger districts like CMS have someone at each school assigned to be the EC compliance facilitator. This is the person in charge of IEP paperwork and compliance at the school. The SEDM can call the school to find out who that person is and include that person on the request to be sure it is received. It's very important to keep a dated copy of this request. This is another added benefit of using email because you automatically get a copy of your sent email. I strongly suggest that you create a folder in your email where you save important communications about your student with the school. Once the school receives the written request for a special education evaluation for a student, a 90-day timeline starts. Within those 90 days, the school must do the following things. First, they must decide whether to evaluate the student. This decision happens in an IEP meeting. I will discuss what happens at these IEP meetings in the next few slides. Next, they must complete all of the evaluations. The specific evaluations they complete are agreed upon at the initial referral meeting. Then it's determined whether the student is eligible. This also happens in an IEP meeting. If the student is eligible, the IEP team then develops the initial IEP. Lastly, the student must begin receiving services. All of these items must be completed within 90 calendar days, not school days. It's also important to understand that the 90-day timeline does not stop for holidays or summer vacation. Therefore, an SEDM could request a special education evaluation for their student on the last day of school. And this process would have to occur during the summer. We generally do not suggest doing that, but it's important to know that it's possible. Too often we hear from families that when trying to request an IEP for their student in the spring of a school year, school staff will say it's too late in the year to request one, and you should wait until the beginning of the next school year. This is simply not the case. In the introduction to IEPs in Section 504 plans, I said that an IEP meeting must happen at least once a year. That annual IEP meeting is called the annual review. Additionally, every student goes through the reevaluation process at least every 3 years, and that occurs during an IEP meeting. We cover the evaluation and reevaluation process in more detail during our evaluations training. Lastly, in order for there to be any changes to the IEP document at all, an IEP meeting must happen. I've included on the slide some possible IEP changes, such as goals, accommodations, special education service time, and related services. But really, any changes to the document at all, no matter how small or good, must trigger an IEP meeting. The IEP is a legal document, and an IEP meeting with all of the notice required by law is necessary to make any changes. This ensures that the IEP remains an accurate, consistent statement of all services the student is receiving and documents any disagreements among the IEP team. SEDMs can and should request an IEP meeting anytime there is a concern. I've included here some of the most common scenarios when SEDM should request an IEP meeting. These include the following: when there is a lack of expected progress toward IEP goals. This does not require the schools telling the family there's been a lack of expected progress. Instead, families should be carefully monitoring their students' progress. In a few slides, I'm going to discuss how to understand your students' progress with the data received from school. Another IEP meeting trigger is when the student has received a new diagnosis or a new evaluation. The SEDM should share this information with the IEP team and request an IEP meeting to discuss how this may impact the student's services. If there's sensitive information about the student and or the student's family in the evaluation, that information can be redacted before sending it. Redacting sounds complicated, but it can be as easy as using a black permanent marker and striking out the sentences or paragraphs that you don't want to share with the district. If a student is experiencing new or increased behavioral challenges, that should prompt a request for an IEP meeting. The IEP team should try to be as proactive as possible to get the student supports they may need to address these challenges. Lastly, if the student is being bullied, an IEP meeting should occur. We have a different training focused entirely on eliminating bullying for students with disabilities. But one of the main takeaways is that if a student with an IEP is being bullied, an IEP meeting needs to occur to determine if changes need to be made to the student's services to ensure that the student continues to receive a free, appropriate public education. Our advice about the process to request an IEP meeting is very similar to our advice about requesting an initial EC evaluation. This request really needs to be made in writing. Again, email is a useful way to be able to send it to multiple people at once and to keep a dated copy for yourself. When a student has an IEP, there is usually an EC staff person in charge of the student's paperwork, called their EC case manager. Often, this is one of the student's special education teachers, but that's not always the case. The EC case manager is the main person to address the request to, but it's ideal to copy at least one other individual on the email, perhaps the teacher, school counselor, or principal. In the IEP meeting request, there are a couple of items that are important to include. First, explain the reason for the meeting. You want the IEP team to be prepared to discuss what you are hoping to discuss. So giving the reason is critical. Second, suggest some possible meeting dates and times that work for you. When scheduling IEP meetings, it's best to be proactive. Otherwise, the school may generate an invitation to conference for a day and time that doesn't work for you, which will result in a lot of time-consuming back and forth with the school that could be avoided up front. Lastly, include your contact information. When requesting an IEP meeting, there's no set time by which the school must respond. The school should, however, be responsive to the request. If you request the meeting and have not heard back within a week, it's time to follow up. Sometimes schools respond to these requests by trying to schedule something more akin to a parent-teacher conference instead of an actual IEP meeting. Sometimes this may be appropriate if it's related to an issue that's not relevant to a student's IEP. Because IEPs are so comprehensive, however, often the meeting should actually be an IEP meeting. IEP meetings are much more formal than parent-teacher conferences and generate legally binding documents. If you want the meeting to be an IEP meeting, make that clear in the request and during the scheduling of the meeting. The information I just discussed is summarized by this graphic. On the left, it shows the initial IEP meeting request and eligibility process. Then it shows periodic requested IEP meetings at the top. Underneath the arrow has the required annual review meeting, and then at the end, the required 3-year reevaluation. Each student's specific situation will look different. For some school years, all that may be needed is the required annual review meeting. At other times, there may be a need for several IEP meetings for a student in one school year. The next topic I want to address is preparing for an IEP meeting. This section is longer than the sections I have about advocacy at the IEP meeting and post-meeting best practices. Preparation is absolutely key to success at an IEP meeting. Ideally, the preparation process should happen weeks before the IEP meeting occurs. Before an IEP meeting, it's critical to review relevant documents, including school records and relevant records and evaluations from outside providers. Effective advocacy during an IEP meeting will use this information to support your point or request with data or information included in the written records. Under the federal law governing special education, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, SEDMs have the right to request and review students' records. While the law does not require that the school district make copies of the school records available, most school districts will provide either physical copies or electronic versions upon request. If copies are provided, the school may charge a reasonable copying fee, although most do not ask parents to pay for copies. This fee can be waived if the fee would effectively prevent the SEDM from having access to their students' records. Records requests should be made in writing to the school. Again, this can be done through an email or a letter, and be sure to keep a dated copy for yourself. Upon request, the record should be provided to the SEDM within a reasonable period of time, which may not exceed 45 days from the date of the request. If the SEDM is requesting the records in advance of an upcoming IEP meeting, the records must be provided to the parent before the meeting. Review the documents closely and make notes for yourself of relevant information related to the reason for the IEP meeting. For instance, if you requested an IEP meeting to discuss behavioral challenges, you'd want to pay close attention to any disciplinary referral documents, as well as relevant information in the student's evaluations and IEP documents. Once you have requested and received your student's records, you need to understand what the data says about your student and their strengths and needs. Be aware of and seek out regular reports about your student's progress. When you make a request in an IEP meeting, the IEP team members are going to ask you for data to support that request. Therefore, it's imperative to be able to understand the information included in reports you receive from school. I'm going to briefly cover the different sources of data included on the slide here. The school should be providing you with regular class progress reports, as well as quarterly report cards and IEP progress reports. Class progress reports give a snapshot in time for a student during a quarter. They generally include the scores on specific assignments and assessments. There can be very helpful information to glean from class progress reports. Review the data on these class progress reports closely and look for any patterns. For instance, Is the student missing many assignments? Is the student scoring well, for instance, on assignments and poorly on tests, or vice versa? Report cards are clearly important to review. In addition to the grades in each class, they generally also contain the student's number of absences so far that school year. For students with IEPs, there should be an IEP progress report. This is typically provided quarterly, like report cards. It's a common issue that SEDMs do not receive their students' IEP progress reports each quarter. The IEP progress report lists the students' annual goals and their progress toward them, as determined by their special education teacher. The best IEP progress reports include specific, individualized comments related to the student's progress for each goal. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen often enough. Often, related service providers include more detailed information for their goals. If the IEP progress report lacks any meaningful information, the SEDM should consider requesting the progress monitoring data for the student. The student's special education provider should be keeping detailed data monitoring the student's progress on each goal. The IEP document itself tells you how each goal will be monitored. Common examples are running records, student work samples, and logs of teacher observations. While the raw progress monitoring data is often not included in response to a school records request, these data should be specifically requested if the SEDM believes it is necessary to understand how the student's goals are being worked on and whether the student is making progress. All families of students in North Carolina public schools need to familiarize themselves with the PowerSchool Parent Portal. The PowerSchool Parent Portal will house the students' current grades, attendance, schedule, and assignments. It's available via computer or smartphone app. I already discussed periodic class progress reports, but that information is always at a parent's fingertips through PowerSchool. The big caveat with PowerSchool is that it is only accurate if the teacher updates it consistently. Not all teachers input data the same way or on the same time frame. PowerSchool alone only gives a fractional understanding of the student's academic life. So it should merely be a prompt for when you may want to speak with the student and or the teacher. We recommend changing the notification setting so that you receive periodic emails with summaries of the student's grades and attendance. Some schools and teachers also utilize other apps such as Class Dojo, Remind, or Parent Square. At the beginning of the school year, find out from the school and each teacher if they use any apps that you can access to see information about your students' academic or behavior progress in class. In preparation for the IEP meeting, review these online data sources closely and make notes of any information that is relevant to your concerns for the IEP meeting. An important piece of data for students in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools is measures of academic progress, or MAP testing. MAP tests are administered in CMS elementary and middle schools 3 times per year at the beginning, middle, and end of the school year. MAP tests assess current academic ability in reading and math. And these are computer adaptive tests, which means that the selection of questions is unique to each student, getting harder or easier based on their responses. For example, if the student answers question 4 incorrectly, question 5 is going to be a bit easier than if they had answered question 4 correctly. MAP scores can tell you whether the student is below, above, or on grade level. It can tell you how they're doing compared to their peers in the school district and also compared to their peers nationally. We like to use MAP scores to establish trends over time, rather than putting any significant amount of weight on any single score. Foundationally, it's important to understand where the student is in relation to their peers and grade level expectations. But after that, the important questions are, is the student progressing relative to their own achievement level? Is the student progressing at a meaningful rate? Here's a bit more information about MAP testing. The score, the RASH unit or RIT, signifies the student's current level of academic ability. The teacher can use that score to personalize the student's curricula. The student's scores are then compared over time to measure progress. Keep track of the student's scores and compare them to the student's expected progress and compare them to the norm grade level mean. In the chart on the slide, the student scores are in blue. The orange is the district grade level mean RIT, and the yellow is the norm grade level mean, which comes from national scores. You can see that this student is performing well below the average scores for the district and nationally. You can also see that the student scores do not seem to be increasing over time. In preparation for the IEP meeting, review the map results closely. For instance, if the student is not making expected progress, this may mean that the student needs additional goals on their IEP, and the type or frequency of their specially designed instruction may need to change. School districts in North Carolina are required to use the Amplify Education Incorporated M-Class Dibble's 8th edition assessment to assess reading fluency and comprehension for kindergarten through 3rd grade students. Similar to MAP tests, they're administered 3 times per school year during those grades. During the beginning of the school year, generally in September, during the middle of the school year in January, and during the end of the year in May. The exact assessment components depend on grade level. Some individual schools choose to use this assessment past 3rd grade. If you have a 4th or 5th grader, you should ask if they continue with this assessment program in those grades at your student's school. It's important to know your student's level compared to grade level expectation, because if your student is far below grade level, they should be receiving reading interventions and progress monitoring by the school, which involves more frequent assessments of the student's level. More frequent progress monitoring should begin automatically by the school if the student is far enough below grade level. If interventions are put into place, the family should be notified and given an opportunity to attend meetings to review the interventions. The M-Class data can be quite confusing to review and interpret. As soon as you receive the information throughout the school year, you should review it closely and ask the teacher questions about the different components and what they mean. That way, when reviewing this data in advance of the IEP meeting, you can more efficiently review it and use the data to support your IEP meeting requests. Homework is another area where families can learn important information about a student's progress. Spend time supporting your student with their homework if your schedule allows. We understand that this is a privilege that not everyone has time for. If you do have the time, this will help you understand the skills the student is expected to display and help you learn about the student's areas of strengths and weakness. If you are not able to be with your student when your student completes homework, it may be helpful to be in contact with the teacher to find out if the teacher posts homework assignments online. Additionally, you can be in touch with whoever might be around your student when they complete their homework to get a better sense of how the student does with those assignments. Inform the student's teachers of any learning issues observed during homework time, and also bring up these observations at the IEP meeting. It may be helpful to have a system for informally tracking observations during homework time and more generally in the home. If, for instance, your student has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, it may be helpful to have some informal notes tracking the student's struggles with homework and how often they need a break. SEDMs have the right to invite anyone they would like to an IEP meeting. SEDMs should carefully consider who they may want to include. One of the first things to think about is the student's participation in the meeting. Starting at age 14, the student begins receiving their own invitation to conference for IEP meetings. Before that time, it is completely up to the SEDM whether they want the student to attend. We do not have standard advice to give on this topic. It's very dependent on the student and the topic of their IEP meeting. What we do encourage, however, is the student's active participation in their education, which means that even if a student is not attending their IEP meeting, their input should be sought in an age-appropriate manner before meetings. It is also possible to have a student attend only a portion of their meeting, which allows for the IEP team to receive input directly from the student and for the student to understand who's on their IEP team without subjecting the student to a lengthy meeting. When communicating with your student, you may want to ask them about what they think is going well in school and what their concerns are. Additionally, ask them what their ideas are for making things better for them in school. The students themselves often have incredible insight to share about what may assist their learning and development. When considering inviting other people to the IEP meeting, I like to break it down into different categories of people. First, individuals with special knowledge about the student. This can be close family members, direct service providers, or others with a close relationship with the student. The second category includes those with expertise about the student's disability. This could be the student's doctor or therapist or someone who has done an outside evaluation. The last category includes those who can support the SEDM during the meeting. Sometimes those individuals fall into one of the other categories, but they don't necessarily need to. IEP meetings can be an incredibly stressful, emotional time for families, and the SEDM may need some assistance with advocating or someone there to provide moral support. A friend can support an SEDM by doing things like taking notes during the meeting, asking for a break when noticing the SEDM getting overwhelmed, or helping to ask questions during the meeting. Families may hire an advocate or attorney to attend the meeting. While their support can be incredibly helpful, the school will likely want to have their own counsel present, which can make meetings more contentious or even harder to schedule. When you invite individuals to an IEP meeting, it's best practice to let the EC case manager know in advance, especially if you are bringing an attorney. If an individual cannot attend the meeting in person, it may still be valuable to seek their input. They can send in a letter for the IEP team's consideration or participate in a portion of the meeting by phone. Our final strategies are about creating your plan for the IEP meeting. I always ask for a draft of the IEP document to be emailed to me in advance of the meeting. I let the EC case manager know that the meeting will be much more efficient if I have a chance to review the draft in advance. They are not obligated to send it, and you may only get it the day before, but it's definitely worth asking. If they send it to you, review the draft side by side with the current IEP. Be aware of exactly what they have proposed to change through the draft. Next, draft statements regarding your concerns for your student's education and your vision for your student's educational future. These questions are on the first page of the IEP document and therefore come up early during IEP meetings. These questions raise an important opportunity to frame the meeting by sharing your concerns and by making clear your hopes for the student. We strongly suggest that you draft these in advance and email them to the EC case manager. That way, those items can be copied and pasted directly into the IEP document, and you do not have to worry about being put on the spot at the start of the meeting. You can take your time to craft them rather than rely on the EC case manager paraphrasing your words during the meeting. For parent concerns, the more specific here, the better. SEDM should include concerns about the student's academic, emotional, social, behavioral, or functional needs. Some examples. I'm concerned that my student is below grade level in reading and math and gets into trouble because he's frustrated about being behind. Or another example, I'm concerned that my student is already in high school, but is not learning skills that will help make him independent, like how to handle money or use public transportation. The concerns listed in the section should be addressed in the other sections of the IEP, such as in the goals and services sections. At the end of the meeting, it may be helpful to ask the team to go back to review the parent concerns to make sure that they have all been addressed. Prepare notes to have with you at the IEP meeting. In these notes, make a list of questions that you would like to get answered during the meeting. Some helpful questions may be things like, who will be delivering the services and supports? How often? When? Where? How and how often will the services be evaluated to determine progress? Lastly, brainstorm any suggestions or interventions that you think may assist your student. These ideas may come from a variety of places. Think about strategies you put in place at home and consider whether they would help in school. Talk to the service providers about the suggestions they have. Even a Google search where you put in the issue or diagnosis can yield some great ideas. You can also connect with other parents of students with disabilities through social media or other online platforms and share ideas. Make sure you are clear about your desired outcome of the meeting. Try to have 2 to 3 goals for the meeting. Knowing your primary goals will help you prioritize your concerns during the meeting. I've spent a long time on how to prepare for the meeting. Let's now turn to strategies to use in the meeting itself. The most important thing to do in the meeting itself is to actively participate. School staff are in a lot of IEP meetings, and in many of those meetings, they're able to proceed quickly and without much input from the family. Therefore, they may not anticipate your participation. We like to say that we want the SEDM and anyone else present on behalf of the student to speak up early and stop that rolling train. Make it clear that this is the meeting where you have prepared to meaningfully participate. You should have a list of questions. Ask those questions at the time that makes sense to you. There are no rules that dictate the order of the discussion. SEDMs can ask that before the team starts focusing on filling out the IEP form, the team has an overall discussion of the real issues, why and how the student struggles, and what would help the student struggle less and learn more. Sometimes families present concerns and are told during the meeting that the concern is not something that can be addressed through the IEP meeting. If that happens, be sure to ask at that time how and when those current concerns can be addressed. Active advocacy during an IEP meeting can be a challenging experience for many families. It can be uncomfortable to question school staff, especially if the teacher or other school professional does not seem to welcome the questions. We encourage families to remember their importance in these meetings and the absolutely critical role they play, since they know their student better than anyone else. Simultaneously, we encourage families to remember that the majority of the time, school staff are trying to do the best they can for students. Additional information about the student's disability, and some fresh suggestions or perspective from the parent can lead to some powerful improvements to the student services. Those suggestions are better received by school staff when coming from an SEDM who is able to control their emotions and maintain a gracious attitude. Our next tip is to carefully review the prior written notice document. We discussed this document in great detail during our preparing for the annual review IEP meeting training. The prior written notice is the IEP form completed at the conclusion of an IEP meeting. It states what the IEP team agreed to, what was considered by the IEP team and rejected, and importantly, what was proposed by the SEDM and refused by the school team members. Having the information clear on the prior written notice is extremely helpful if the SEDM wants to pursue any dispute resolution strategies. Everything that occurred at the IEP meeting should be documented on the prior written notice form. If you don't agree with how something is stated on the prior written notice, let the team know what your concerns are and how you believe the information should be documented on the prior written notice. A word of caution. Sometimes there are great ideas tossed around at a meeting but are not documented. In that situation, we assume that those ideas will not be implemented. Make sure that all of the important points from the meeting are documented, either on the IEP document itself or in the prior written notice. Before the meeting ends, be sure to do the following. Review your list of questions and make sure you have asked them all and have received an answer. Be sure to know who is responsible for implementing the different parts of the IEP. Sometimes these meetings run much longer than anyone expected. If you run out of time before everything has been addressed, Schedule another meeting while the IEP team is still gathered. Signing the IEP only indicates that you are present and not necessarily that you agree with the contents. Do not worry that signing the IEP will mean that you can't pursue dispute resolution strategies if necessary. And get a copy of all of the documents from the meeting. It's ideal to get the documents at that time instead of relying on someone to send them afterwards. The prior written notice document should be included in all of those documents. The work is not done when the IEP meeting ends. Here are some steps to take. First, review the IEP documents. You would be surprised how often I review the IEP documents after a meeting and find errors that were made during the meeting. I suggest taking a day or so after the meeting ends and then reviewing the documents closely. Make sure that you have received everything and follow up on any corrections that need to be made. If the prior written notice did not fully capture your point of view, follow up with a letter and ask it to be included in your students' records. Next, review your notes from the meeting. If there were any action items that you or others were supposed to take, make sure to follow up on those items. Share the IEP documents with any other involved parties as appropriate, such as tutors, counselors, and therapists. Lastly, make sure you are keeping all of the school-related documents organized in one place. You'll be very grateful for that when it comes time to prepare for the next meeting. I've included here some strategies for remaining engaged with the student's education following the meeting. As we have discussed at length, keep track of your student's progress. Maintain regular communication with your student about school. Make that a part of your regular routine with your student from kindergarten through high school graduation. Be in regular contact with the school. Relationships are best built and maintained when they include communication when things are going well, in addition to when there is a crisis or concern. And if possible, volunteer with the school. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss the options families have when they disagree with the outcome of an IEP meeting. We have another training specifically focused on the special education dispute resolution, where we cover the following strategies: independent educational evaluations, or IEEs, facilitated IEP meetings, mediation, state complaints, and due process. I hope the information provided through this webinar has been helpful. If you believe you may need legal representation related to a Section 5 special education or school discipline issue, please contact our team. For court-involved youth, members of the child and family team or a student's juvenile defense attorney can make a referral for our education navigation service. And you can also contact us if you want us to provide a training. I've provided here some links to some helpful resources, including the North Carolina policies governing services for children with disabilities. Also, please be sure to review the handouts for this webinar. Please remember also to complete your post-workshop survey. It should only take a couple minutes, and it will provide us with feedback that we can use to improve our webinars and presentations. Thank you again for watching.